ever since the days of the Occupy movement, in fact, going back many decades, people have wondered what exactly the federal government is doing and how it views protesters, and especially leftist protesters. What does the federal government think? How does it view these protesters? Of whom is it suspicious, and that sort of thing. And recently some documents came to light that said, among other things, how you dress can definitely influence the way the federal government recommends you be treated, or at least that's my understanding, but our next guest will hopefully explain it more knowledgeably than I just did. Gunita Singh is an attorney. She is, in fact, staff attorney for a group called Property of the People, and Property of the People uncovers government documents, files Freedom of Information Act requests, and so on. Gunita is familiar with oversight of law enforcement and related issues, police misconduct, animal protection, environmentalism, marriage equality, civil rights, a number of areas of interest to us here at this program, and she joins us now. So first of all, Gunita, thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Secondly, how badly did I mangle the conclusions that might be drawn from these documents? Maybe you can give us an overview.
You certainly didn't mangle them. If we dive deeply into the field analysis report from September of 2016, even the way they phrase the narrative in that report, the Department of Homeland Security, as between lawfully protesting white supremacists versus anarchist extremists, that phrasing alone is so problematic for so many reasons. But as we dig a little bit deeper, we see even more reasons to deem this completely problematic. So, for example, the potential indicators of planned violence that law enforcement can use to, quote unquote, justify increased suspicions of counter-protesters includes things like wearing dark clothing or bandanas, or even carpooling to a demonstration, actions that could apply to scores of citizens engaged in zero wrongdoing whatsoever. So, no, you didn't mangle any of that.
Well, you know, I qualify on 2 or 3 accounts. I always carpool to demonstrations because I hate driving in traffic, number one. And number 2, I'm wearing dark clothing right now. I'm not big on bandanas, but that's just a fashion thing. What also struck me as I looked through the documents that you guys were able to gain possession of, what also struck me, I should say, I was pondering as I read them, was we're talking about white supremacists here. They seem to be taking a very gentle touch towards white supremacists when a white supremacist actually killed a counter demonstrator with his car, as I recall. So it seemed to me, maybe it's just me, but it seemed to me that there was a kind of a slanted take here against anarchists and the left. And I won't say for white supremacist demonstrators, but it seemed to me there was a certain concern for protecting the well-being of the white supremacists, and perhaps less so on the part of the anarchists and leftists. Does that make sense to you?
It certainly does. And as unfortunate as it is to acknowledge that, I think it's important that we do. You're really hitting the nail on the head. Law enforcement and the intelligence community, their extremism designations are inherently political. We know this based on the starkly different responses they have toward white power movements versus the reactions by people of color to simply protect themselves from white power. Both law enforcement and the intelligence community should be out there trying to stop white power groups that actually have the track record of murdering people. And part of why our FOIA work is so valuable is because it allows us to make connections about our culture and our history that prove extremely useful when discerning where we as lawyers, activists, and citizens generally should be directing our efforts to create change. Let's not forget, J. Edgar Hoover wrote an anonymous letter to MLK encouraging him to kill himself. It wasn't until 2008 that Nelson Mandela was taken off the terror watch list. That bend, as you described, towards suppressing activists and quelling civil disobedience is deeply embedded, not just in law enforcement culture, but in our government's approach to dealing with any sort of challenge to the status quo. And that's why we at Property of the People diligently and aggressively use the FOIA to foster greater transparency and ultimately hold the government accountable.
Well, I'm really glad, and again, we're talking with Gunita Singh of Property of the People. I'm really glad that you brought up the historical dimension of this here, Gunita, because it seems to me, first of all, as your documents reveal, this is not, people know, a lot of people were horrified by Donald Trump's saying there were good people on both sides and so on, and seeming to, wink and nod and do more than that to white nationalists. But this is not something that is unique to Donald Trump's administration. Some of your documents go back to the Obama administration. In fact, 2011, there were documents suggesting coordination against the Occupy movement that involved bank security and so on, JP Morgan Chase security, I think it was. And then going all the way back to J. Edgar Hoover, as you point out, or during various peace movements at various points in history. So this is not something that's new, but even though some of us have seen this bias over the years, we saw, for example, that when the FBI during the Obama years tried to, maybe look at violent white groups, there was pushback from the Republican Party against investigating conservative-leaning groups, even though the Timothy McVeigh performed the second greatest act of terrorism in American history and so on, and the killings of police officers and others by far-right groups. So I guess what should we know about this? I'm gathering that the documents that were uncovered about how to protect white supremacists from anarchists and so on, these really tell us that this historical bias is at least as intense as ever, right?
The historical bias still very much presents itself in modern law enforcement operations. I know that some of the emails contained in our recent release discuss how the FBI deployed at least 10 flights of planes equipped with advanced aerial surveillance technology to monitor the Baltimore protests over the death of Freddie Gray. So the disparity in resources that are deployed, as I mentioned before, to combat white power and white supremacists on one hand versus the individuals protecting themselves from that, it's deeply problematic.
And Gunita, I'm just going to interrupt you for a second since you brought that up, because one of those emails struck me a lot, and it's obscured who it's from and to in this, but it is the subject line: Baltimore corrections officers allegedly looted 7-Eleven during riots. And this is the security apparatus, the national security apparatus of the American state, the authors of this. And it points to the fact that 2 Baltimore corrections officers were charged this week with looting a downtown 7-Eleven during riots over the death of Freddie Gray. The video above purportedly shows one of them carrying Slim Jims out of the store, while the other one, who is named, stands by the door holding a bag of Tostitos. And it is the lead statement in this is "Stay classy, Baltimore." So you have basically the national security state devoting at least a portion of its attention to the purported theft of Slim Jims and Tostitos, while lives are at stake. And it strikes me that this is a reflection of at least one dimension of our national security culture, and a very disturbing one, because it suggests a hostility to civil rights movements, to Black Lives Matter, and frankly, candidly, to Black people in general. Am I being unfair?
Completely. And I just want to point out, I'm glad you brought that up, because it points to the sheer hypocrisy embedded deeply within law enforcement culture, don't you think?
Well, absolutely. And I said, am I being unfair? And you said completely. I think you mean I was being fair. But,
Are
um,
completely.
and we don't know the name of the author, but we do know that the author of this email was a senior intelligence analyst with the Domestic Terrorism Unit. In other words, so we have a white supremacist movement whose members have murdered police officers, murdered other first responders, murdered protesters, committed other acts of violence, and yet someone whose job is analyzing intelligence for homeland violent extremism is worried about the theft of Slim Jims and Tostitos. That to me is an example of the politicization of the process that you're describing, is it not?
It certainly is. And the whole reason that we use the FOIA so diligently and aggressively toward law enforcement and the intelligence community is because of those misplaced and mismatched priorities that you're alluding to.
And then you have another one. Okay, and obviously we don't have time to go through all of them, but I'm just the ones that jumped out at me. Suspect arrested in University of Chicago gun threat. And it names a 21-year-old student, I guess, accused of threatening to kill students and staff. He purportedly posted online that he planned to kill 16 white male students or staff. Now, what struck me about this was that, again, we have the intelligence apparatus of the American state focusing on this, disseminating this, which, by the way, comes from CNN, not from them, without, and again, it's an intentional issue. It's somebody who appears to be just randomly outraged and making threats, where we have entire systems or networks of people threatening death all the time on the right. Now, am I just cherry picking? Is this my own selection bias and which ones I choose to look at? Because they do also look at ex-cop urges lone wolf patriots to attack Black Lives Matter activists. But overall, it seems to me that their hand they're putting a heavy hand on protesters and the wearing of black and that sort of thing. How do we make sense of all of this, I guess, is what I'm trying to ask.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair assessment. So I'll just go back to some background information about why we sought these documents in the first place, and hopefully that'll shed some more light on what you're saying. Property of the people, we sued the government for records on a new threat category called Black Identity Extremism, a designation that in and of itself is deeply problematic for a multitude of reasons, including, as you keep bringing up, not nearly enough resources seem to be directed at the federal level toward combating white supremacy and the violent discriminatory tactics employed by white nationalists. So our hope with our lawsuit is to have the government comply with the Freedom of Information Act as required by law, so we can obtain the agency's documents surrounding this absurd threat category, because only when armed with the right information can we better address this grossly troublesome relationship to things like terrorism, what the government deems extremism, what it doesn't deem extremism, and so on.
Have there been, let's talk about Black identity for a second before we go, this notion that Black identity extremism represents a threat. First of all, the category seems to me to be inherently ideological, because merely saying that you want to, not only perhaps a gross oversimplification, we could get into the political science of it, but I mean, to me, to even create the categorization suggests that if you're interested in promoting Black lives, Black pride, whatever Black identity means to me, that inherently makes you a threat, even though that would be, by definition, peaceful, unless someone married that to a threat of some kind. So it seems to me that the entire category is problematic. And secondly, it seems to me that so far, at least what they've provided in response to your Freedom of Information request seems to me to be just kind of trolling or whatever, surfing the net for anything that might broadly fall into that category, so that both unless this is not representative of the work they're doing, it seems to me both a miscategorization or a sort of guilt by association definition combined with, there's really not much to look at. There's not much for them to do because of what they categorize as black identity is largely nonviolent, so they're just looking for threats that might fit the definition. What do you think?
I mean, as I said before, when discussing how law enforcement and the intelligence community's extremism designations are inherently political, this is nothing new. Whether it is Black Lives Matter, Black identity extremists, in quote, we see it with the animal rights movement, which you brought up during my bio earlier. The animal rights movement causes a loss of profits to foresting corporations, factory farms, labs, but are they a terrorist threat? That's what the timber, meat, and fur industries have been trying to tell the FBI for decades, even though animal rights activists haven't injured a single human being the whole time, just like Black Lives Matter hasn't injured a single human being the whole time.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, they investigated the Quakers during the protests to the Iraq War, and we all know that they're not the roughest group around. So, look, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, but I think what the documents you reveal your show is that there is politicization, that what we've been saying all along, you have provided some documentation for. So I thank you guys for that. Where can people go to learn more?
We have a new website that's currently being developed right now, but as of now, people can go to operation45.org, all one word, all lowercase, where they can learn more about our work, and if they're so inclined, they can donate too.
Okay, great. And in the meantime, I don't care what they say, I'm going to continue to wear black. So Gunita Singh, staff attorney for Property of the People, thanks to you guys for doing this great work, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you so much.